But I always sort of had the idea that whenever I heard of a minister who was noted for evangelism, I formed a sort of a stereotype in my mind of what that person was like. He was sort of a bold, extrovertish type that went up and grabbed people by the lapels and said, "Brother, are you saved?" And I want you to know that, like many of you, that's about as far from a description of myself as I can possibly imagine. I have always considered myself to be shy, though I must confess I have a little difficulty convincing some of our church members of that fact, but it's absolutely the gospel truth. And this manifested itself particularly when it came to witnessing. I found that it was extremely difficult for me to do. In fact, I had difficulty going up and saying good morning to a complete stranger, much less talking to him about something as personal as religion. Now, many people have excuses for why they don't witness, and you all know what an excuse is. That is the skin of a reason stuffed with a lie. And we all are expert at excuses, I think. We have been practicing them ever since the man said, "The woman that thou gavest me made me do it. The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat." And with one accord, they all began to make excuse. And I've often found it interesting that at the final judgment, we're told that we will be without excuse. I have heard many excuses from many people about why they do not engage in evangelism or why they don't get into the evangelism program. They're too busy, or they're too this, or they're too that. But I can't help but remember the story about the Chinese man who got a new plow. And a couple of weeks later, his neighbor came over and he wanted to borrow his new plow. And he said, "Well, I'm sorry, I can't let you use it because my wife is combing her hair with it." He said, "Your wife is combing her hair with your plow?" He said, "Well, not really, but when you don't want to do something, one excuse is as good as another." And we hear a lot of them, and I had a lot of them myself as to why I didn't witness. But I had felt the call into the ministry and went to seminary, graduated from seminary and took the requisite courses in preaching, and came down here to Fort Lauderdale right out of seminary to start a new church. And I was full of vim and vinegar, and I was a veritable Daniel come to judgment, and I preached everything I had in every sermon, and that wasn't a whole lot. But nevertheless, I gave it what I could, and we put an ad in the paper, and we gathered together about 45 people into a school cafetorium, unair conditioned, at 8:30 on Sunday morning. And they were what I might describe as 45 heterogeneous pagans. Maybe some of you didn't know how we started Presbyterian churches. I see some of you suspected that's how we started Presbyterian churches. How do you think we get them into the shape that they're in if we don't start them right? And so I gathered these 45 people together, and I just preached to them with everything. In fact, I preached to them some of the greatest sermons. To be perfectly honest, I preached to them the greatest sermons that have ever been preached in the history of the church. Now, I would like to be humble about it, but I feel it's important that I be honest about it as well. And so I'll say it again. I preached to them some of the greatest sermons that have ever been preached by Spurgeon and Claren and Luther and Calvin. In fact, so powerful was that preaching that in the short space of some 10 months, I had taken that little struggling band of 45 people and had built it up into a mighty army of 17. which in Presbyterian circles is what is called a Scottish revival. Now, you know, in 10 months I'd gone from 45 to 17, and just a little bit of extrapolation made it very clear that any way you looked at it, I had about 2.5 months of ministry left until I was going to be preaching rather to my wife, who was threatening to go to the Baptist church down the street, however. And it was about then that I decided that I better try something different, change my tactics. So I figured that if the mountain wouldn't come to Mohammed, then Mohammed would go to the mountain. So I decided that I would visit somebody and I would proclaim the gospel to them right where they were. Now, as I said, I had a very good reason why I didn't do that sort of thing, unlike the excuses that so many other people had. I had a valid reason. You see, I have always suffered from a serious back ailment. I have this broad yellow stripe that goes right down my back, and somehow or another it connects to my jawbone, and it has rendered me absolutely silent in many circumstances when the less circumspect would no doubt have opened their mouth and said who knows what. But in spite of that back defect, I decided I had best go and visit somebody anyway. So I got a card that looked like it had been signed by a little old lady from the shaky handwriting. And I figured if I couldn't out-talk her, I could at least outrun her, even with my back problem. So I had a second brilliant idea. I decided that I would take somebody else with me, and they could learn how to do it from watching me. Now that was brilliant, because I didn't have the faintest idea how to do it, which fact was to come very painfully home to me shortly. So I knocked on the door of this home, and I waited for this little old lady with her gray hair to open the door, and the door opened, and I found myself staring at a belly button. He was about that big. In fact, he has his own television program now. It's called The Hulk, I think. There he was in an undershirt. He had a can of beer in one hand and a cigar in his mouth. Now, he was just my sort of person, the type that I had really been looking for to begin my witnessing career with. So I said to him, "Is Mrs. Jones home?" And he said, "Nah." I said, "Thank you very much." And I started to leave. And he said, "What'd you want with her?" Nothing. Nothing at all, I assure you. The fact of the matter is, I'm the pastor of this little church down the street here. It's a very little church. Wouldn't hurt anyone. And the truth is that your mother visited us last Sunday, and I was just returning the compliment, but you can just tell her that we dropped by. And then this guy said one of the nastiest things that I have ever heard come out of the mouth of any human being. Now, some of you pastors here know that people can be downright ugly to preachers at times, and this man really did it. Now, I want you to understand that I had done nothing to provoke this fellow. I mean, absolutely nothing. You can bank on that. But right out of the blue, he said to me, "Come in." Can you believe that? I mean, ugly. And Evangelism Explosion International started right there, with me walking into that living room with my knees knocking together. And we sat there, and we had a very, very enlightening and edifying conversation about the weather. And we progressed from there to sports. He was a Golden Gloves fighter. We got off of that in a hurry. Moved on to the news. There wasn't much new. And back to the weather. It was getting warmer. When my layman, who was with me, said, "Sick him." I said, "Hush, man, you'll get us both killed." I said, "I'm working up to it." I'd been working up to it for years. I just wasn't up to it, any way you looked at it. And finally, with great chagrin, I finally told this man, God forgive me, how much I had enjoyed the visit. And we excused ourselves and left. And you know something? I couldn't even look at that layman all the way back. I mean, not only would the mountain not come to Mohammed, but Mohammed couldn't even climb a molehill. And it was a very embarrassing situation. And I got back to my home, and I want you to know that I prayed earnestly, Lord, what am I doing here? Surely this is all a big mistake. Surely you didn't call me into the ministry to miserably fail like this. And I want you to know that I really wondered if I shouldn't leave the ministry and take up something else. And about that very time, I got a letter. I got a letter from a preacher up in Greater Atlanta, where I'd gone to seminary, and I'd attended this church a number of times. And he wanted me to come up to Atlanta and, believe it or not, conduct 10 days of evangelistic services. That's right. This fella, who had just decimated one church almost entirely, now he wanted me to ship it across state lines. Have plague will travel. So I packed up some of our sermons and I headed north. I was very happy to get away from my Fort Lauderdale fiasco. And I showed up and I told this fellow, I said, here I am. And he said, I'm ready. And he said, that's great. He said, you'll be preaching every night. And I said, wonderful. He said, however, that's not the most important thing. And I suddenly had a cold chill that went right down my yellow stripe. And I said to myself, oh Lord, don't let this guy say what I think he's going to say next. I said, Lord, he looks like that type. And sure enough, he was. And he did. He said, the most important thing is that every morning we're going to go out into the homes, and in the afternoon the same thing, and sometime at night after the services, and you're going to have an opportunity to witness to these people eyeball to eyeball and toenail to toenail. And he said, I've saved all the tough nuts for you. Thanks a lot. I said, that's great. I said, actually, you know, we professional evangelists don't like to fool with anything but tough nuts. To be perfectly honest, in my whole ministry, I've never dealt with anything but tough nuts. I said, there's just one problem, however. I just came up here to Atlanta to tell you that I wasn't going to be able to come. Because of this funeral you're going to have here in town if I don't get out of here quick. No, I didn't say that. I was trapped, and I didn't know what to do. I went back to my hotel room that night, and I got down on my knees, and I prayed, oh, Lord, what am I going to do now? I don't know how to witness to anybody. I felt like an MD that just graduated from medical school, and they were going to slap a scalpel in my hand the next morning, and I hadn't the faintest idea how to cut anybody open. And what am I going to do? This preacher's going to be sitting there looking at me. I said, Lord, what am I going to do? You know what happened? Nothing. So I got down on my face on the floor. I mean, I was flat out on my face on the floor, and I prayed for hours. I said, Lord, you've got to help me. I can't do this. I am absolutely desperate, and I don't know what I'm going to do. This fellow's coming to get me in the morning, and I don't have any idea what I'm going to do. You've got to do something. Most amazing thing happened. Morning came. And the preacher came shortly thereafter and picked me up. And we went to a home, and we knocked on the door, and the door opened. You remember that big hulk of a fella in Fort Lauderdale? He'd moved to Atlanta. Well, not really. It was his bigger cousin, I think. And we went in, and I was going over in my mind quickly what was the latest thing in the news, sports, and weather, when this preacher blew the whole morning. He said, well, Hank, he said, I've brought this professional evangelist out here to talk to you about your soul. And there it was, bum-ba-dum-bum. And he pointed to me. And I gulped a couple of times real hard. And I was in such a state of panic, I didn't know what to do. I looked over at the preacher, and I looked over at the hulk, and I looked up to the Lord, and I tried desperately to grasp for something, and all of a sudden, I remembered a text. Do the thing that you fear. I think that's 2 Ecclesiastes 3:2. Jump right in. So I jumped right in, feet first. And you may not believe this after what I've just told you, but in no more than 20 minutes, I had that big fella furious. He was getting redder, and I was getting whiter by the minute. And it was while I was lying there in the middle of the living room floor, breathing between his teeth, that I suddenly realized what the whole problem was. It came like a flash of illumination right out of Systematic Theology 302b, I believe. Suddenly, everything was clear. The problem was simple. Any theologian with an ounce of theological acumen would certainly understand what the problem was. The problem was that this man was evidently non-elect. It's very simple. I felt so much better immediately. You know, it's a funny thing. I told that story at Calvin Seminary, and nobody laughed. I told it at Asbury Seminary, and they carried 3 people out in stretchers. Well, my pastor friend had come to a very different conclusion. The problem, indeed, was simple. As far as he was concerned, the problem was that I was a non-evangelist. And so he took over the conversation, and in no more than 15 minutes, he had this man on his knees accepting Christ. Now, I want to tell you, that was a very traumatic experience for a young, budding theologue to see the non-elect get converted right before his eyes, you know. And during that week, those 10 days, some 54 people came forward in those meetings. However, on any given evening, I could have told you who it was that was going to come forward because I had seen that pastor lead them to Christ during that week. And I want you to know that was an amazing experience to me. I said to the pastor, I said, this is absolutely incredible. I saw a murderer accept Christ. I saw an adulteress accept Christ, and all sorts of people in between. And I said, how in the world did you ever learn to do this? He said, why, a year ago I didn't know how. I said, you're kidding. What happened? He said, it was at this very same evangelistic crusade last year. He said, last year we really had an evangelist. I said, oh. And he took me out with him, and I learned from watching him. Well, I learned from watching this fellow, and I came back to Fort Lauderdale, and I want you to know I was really enthusiastic. But there was one question that was buzzing around my mind as I was flying back. And I want you to know what it was. I said to myself, yes, this works in Atlanta, the heart of the Bible Belt, but will it work in Fort Lauderdale? That was the question. Well, I found out that it works in Fort Lauderdale. It works anywhere that it's tried, in the inner city and in the outlying rural regions. It works in America and Canada and England and Africa and Hong Kong and Singapore and Australia. It works because it is nothing other than believers carrying the gospel of Jesus Christ to others, just as Christ said that we should. And it carries with it a written guarantee that his word will not return unto him void. And so I came back to Fort Lauderdale, and I began to do exactly what this fellow had done. The fact of the matter is, I even began to sound like him, developed a real southern accent there for a while, picked up some of his idiosyncrasies. I always knew when he was going to get into the gospel, because he had this idiosyncrasy. He would always slap his knee before he would go into the gospel. So I would sort of run up the hill, and I'd get right up to the point of getting into the gospel, and I'd sort of get stuck. I'd screw up my courage, the sticking place, and then I'd slap my knee, and I'd get over the hill, and I'd be into the gospel. It was just as simple as that. So that, my friends, is the key to Evangelism Explosion International. Everybody together, right hand on the right knee. Let's see it. Beautiful. Now, aren't you glad you came all the way around the world to this clinic to learn that amazing trick of evangelism? Well, that helped me for the first year, and by the grace of God, I even got to the place where I didn't have to slap my knee. So I started running around. I was busier than a one-armed paper hanger with a itch, and I started witnessing to people everywhere, and sure enough, people responded here just like they did up there, and people began to accept the Lord. And I look out right here, and I see several people that accepted Christ in those first few months when I came back from Atlanta 22 years ago. And God is still working in their lives. And I praise the Lord for that. And after about a year, I stopped long enough, and I was panting breathlessly, and I said to myself, you know, there's only a certain number of people that I can reach. And then I had an idea. Why don't I teach some others to do the same thing? And so that's sort of where Evangelism Explosion really began. I took a man out with me, an elderly gentleman, been a Christian about 60 years, and always wanted to lead someone to the Lord, never knew how. And I took him out for months and months. I thought I'd never get rid of him. Finally put both feet in the small of his back and pushed him out of the nest, and he went out again to lead a lot of people to Christ. And then there was another man that I took out for a month or so and went away on vacation. He called me up the next week. He'd gone out and led somebody to Christ. And I said to myself, I said, Lord, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the way. And I will report that from around the world there come stories of the fact that this is the way, because this is what Jesus did. He called the disciples that they should be with him. And it wasn't until somebody took me by the hand and led me out, that I began to overcome that blinding fear that so silences so many people in the church. And dear friends and pastors, may I say that Christ says to you that you're to equip the saints to do the work of ministry. And that's a great thing. And to those of you that are lay people, may I say that the greatest privilege and greatest responsibility you'll ever know is a privilege of being able to lead another person to Jesus Christ. You heard a man give a testimony tonight of what learning to witness has meant in his life. Here was a man who was stuttered all of his life, couldn't even say his name, dropped out of college 2 or 3 times because he couldn't say his name when he was asked to stand up in class, couldn't even say evangelism explosion, but God is using him mightily to bring people to Christ today. What is your excuse? And whenever I think about excuses, I always remember a story that was told by Bob Pierce. The first Christian job I ever had was showing films for World Vision International. Bob Pierce was a compassionate, moving gentleman that was concerned about the offscourings of this world, the orphans and the lepers. And I remember in one of those films, he was visiting one of the leprosariums in Korea, which they had founded. And they passed through the various rooms of this leprosarium until the patients got progressively worse and worse and worse until they came to the ward farthest back where the terminal patients were located. And they went into that room. He went in with the chief surgeon. And there against the wall of this ward farthest back was the worst patient in the whole hospital. He was a man, Korean man, who had lost all of his toes and all of his fingers. He could no longer stand or walk. In fact, he could not sit up. He could not speak because he had lost his tongue. He could not see because the ravages of leprosy had blinded him. His teeth had all fallen out, and he had lost his hearing. He could not walk, he could not talk, he could not see, and he could not hear. But he could do one thing. He could still feel. And he felt the vibrations of these 2 men as they approached his bed. He didn't know who they were. But while there in that hospital, before the disease had reached that critical stage, he had heard the gospel of Christ, the good news of his mercy and free grace, and he had received the Lord Jesus Christ into his heart, and he had come to know the joy of everlasting life. And he wanted to share that with others. He had what you might well call a valid excuse. He couldn't speak, see, hear, stand, or walk. But he did not let that deter him at all. As the vibrations grew stronger, he lifted himself up onto one elbow on his bed, which was all that he could manage. And he took his fingerless hand and pointed it to the sky. And he smiled a toothless smile that spread from ear to ear. And he stared with sightless orbs in the direction of those who approached his bed. And with that great grin on his face, he bore witness to him who had brought him joy and life. I have never forgotten that man, and I hope that you never will also, because one day it just might be that when you get ready to give your excuses to the Lord as to why you didn't witness, you might find that he's standing right next to you. Pastors, God is going to bless you and make you a blessing. And I want you to know that your people will rise up and call you blessed if you will indeed make them to become fishers of men. And you know, it isn't easy. I want to make one thing clear. It isn't easy. It's an uphill climb all of the way because it's contrary to human nature for a person to face the laughter of the world and to continue to witness for Christ in spite of rejection or vilification. But God will bless you if you have the courage to persevere and if you are willing to set the example of leading your people out. Let me close with the example, an example that has meant a lot to me. I think that one of the things that is most needed in witnessing is courage. And I know that because that was something that I most lacked and something that was the greatest struggle for me. I think that what is most needed in Christian witnesses today, Christian pastors and Christian laymen, is courage. And I think that in spite of all of the reasons that are given, the basic reason why people don't witness is because we are cowards. We paint that over. We don't like to admit that, but that indeed, I'm afraid, is the truth. Let me tell you about a man who was a true leader. And you know what the secret of leadership is? The secret of leadership is very simple. It is to lead. But too many times we as pastors, we simply want to point. We say, that's the way. Go that way. But Jesus said, follow me. There was a leader who wasn't a Christian, but he was a great leader of men. His name was Alexander. We call him the Great. He led an army halfway around the world and conquered the whole known world at the time and wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. He was a leader because he feared nothing at all. He wasn't afraid of all of the Persian spears and arrows, and nothing could bring him down off of his great horse, Bucephalus. And one thing he couldn't tolerate in any of his soldiers was cowardice. One day, he was holding court for his army in a great palace, seated upon a golden throne. And one after another, the soldiers were brought before him, and the sergeant at arms read off the accusations. All around the sides of the room, there were soldiers standing at attention with their spears at their side. No eyes shifted, no, everyone looked straight ahead. And one after another, upon one after another, the king pronounced his sentence peremptorily and often without mercy, and there was none that could deliver out of his hand. For he was a ruler of the whole world. And he was a hard taskmaster. And frequently the sentence was death. But there came a young man, no more than about 17 years of age. He was a Grecian lad, or Macedonian perhaps. Unusual boy for that part of the world, blond, blue-eyed, of handsome countenance. The king looked down at him. No one shifted their eyes. No one looked. As the king looked at him, people saw the hardness leave the king's face. And then they heard him say to the young man, "What is his crime?" And the sergeant responded, and he said, "He was found fleeing in the face of the enemy and cringing in a cave." And the king's features hardened again, for that was one thing that he could not tolerate. But as he looked upon the boy, he was so young and such a fine-looking lad that again the king's face softened, and he said to him, "Son, what's your name? And with that, everyone in the room knew that he had won the king's heart. And the boy breathed a sigh of relief, and he said, Alexander. And the smile left the king's face. And he said, what is your name? And the boy snapped to attention. He said, Alexander, sir. And the king began to crimson. And he said to him, what is your name? And the boy stammered and said, Alexander, sir. And the king exploded out of his chair and grabbed him by the tunic, picked him off his feet, and threw him on the ground. And he said to him, soldier, change your conduct or change your name. Man, woman, what is your name? Christian, what is your name? Christian, my Lord, what is your name? Christian, my God, dare you, who have maintained a craven silence when commanded to proclaim the gospel to every creature, dare you, who through all of these decades has refused to bear witness to the name of him who set his face as flint towards Jerusalem, dare you take upon your lips that sacred name? Man, change your conduct or change your name. May we pray. Father, forgive us that too often we have, in the face of the adversary, fled and have been found cringing. Or we have done that which amounts to the same. We have denied thy name. We have heard the blessed name of Christ dragged in the mud and have said nothing. We have seen people sicken and die, and we have allowed them to be launched out into a Christless eternity, and we have said nothing. We pray that thou wilt forgive us, and indeed, Lord Jesus Christ, that thou wilt make us to become fishers of men. For thy sake. Amen.